Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast with a very, very special series that I'm doing with my father, Stuart Alsop II. We have today Steve Case, and Steve is the former CEO of AOL and now working on Revolution, and we'll get into all of that stuff. But welcome to the show, Steve.
Good to be with you both.
So, Steve, I've been sitting here trying to figure out. We have way too much to talk about for the time we have allotted, so I'm going to skip around a bit. But I never figured out how you became CEO of AOL, because you were VP of marketing, and I think you started with control video, and then it became quantum computer sciences. And that was Kleiner involved in that? Were they an investor? And having becoming CEO?
It's a long story. I joined a company that you mentioned, Quantum Computer Services, in 1983, that Kleiner was an investor in. That company struggled, and a few months after I joined, something like 7 or 80% of the team was laid off. We were down to a core group of, I think it was 15 or 20 left. And that we tried for a couple of years to make that work and couldn't really, and eventually decided to spin off and do a new company that Kleiner decided not to back. But a couple of years later, on a subsequent round, they did decide to invest, and Frank Caulfield ended up joining the board. So it was the first thing didn't work out too well. The second thing, it started slow, and the AOL journey was more of a struggle for the first decade or so, but finally things started accelerating in the mid 90s. So a little bit circuitous, but all's well ends well.
Yeah, exactly. No, I remember that. I remember Apple Link. Was it Apple Link and Commodore C Link or something like that? But so you were doing stuff with different manufacturers, and then I think it was actually the Apple thing that ended up becoming AOL, partially because Apple decided not to work with you.
Well, yeah. So the company started, as I said, in '85. We only raised $1 million to launch the company, so we knew we wouldn't win, if it was about just investing marketing dollars, because at the time, you'll recall, most people won't, there was a joint venture with IBM and Sears and CBS called Prodigy, and they committed $1 billion. So our $1 million was not going to beat $1 billion. So our strategy really was to partner with the PC manufacturers, particularly ones focused on the home, the consumer. And the first one, Commodore 64, we did a service called Q-Link. The second was with Radio Shack. Tandy did a service called PC Link, and then we did one with IBM called Promenade, and then we did one with Apple called Apple Link Personal Edition. And so that's the first 5 years or so of our company really was those specialized, customized, private label, white label services. And it was 5 years into it that Apple decided they didn't really want a partnership. They licensed their Apple brand name to us, which I don't think had done before or since, and regretted that. So we ended up having to rebrand that, and that's where essentially became America Online.
And
I should give you credit actually for some of that story, because our first service launched in the fall of 1985. We weren't quite sure what was next, and we're able to establish this partnership with Radio Shack, in part because of meeting a guy, Howard Elias, at your Agenda conference.
At the Agenda conference.
So we might not have survived, for the next leg of the stool if it hadn't been for that chance meeting at your conference.
I'll take credit. What the heck? It's
you should get credit.
Steve, how did
the point of Agenda? But yeah,
how did you end up at Agenda? How did you two meet?
We met before that in your office in Virginia.
Yeah. I think 83, 84, 85, 86. I was starting to attend different events. Most of the events at the time, like the PC Forum with Esther Dyson, it was running. I would attend, but frankly, it was all about semiconductors, hardware, and software. Nobody was talking about the internet. We were kind of the lonely little bit at those conferences, but still found it useful to meet people, and sometimes that led to interesting opportunities, including as I mentioned at Agenda.
So, Steve, the natural question for me to ask is, how did you become so fascinated with entrepreneurship? Since sort of post AOL, that's been a big theme of what you've talked about, certainly with the rise of the rest and with Revolution.
Well, I spent about 20 years building AOL, and then when we merged with Time Warner, stepped aside as CEO, and I was 40-ish, and the question was, what was I going to do next? And didn't really feel like starting another company, but did think it'd be interesting to back the next generation of entrepreneurs. Initially, more personal investments out of a family office, but then a few years after that, decided to scale it up and build more of a platform, which is what Revolution is. Now we have the Rise of Rest Seed Fund, Revolution Ventures, and Revolution Growth. But as part of that, I also got involved, probably 13, 14 years ago, with policy, here in Washington, D.C. related to entrepreneurship. I was asked to co-chair the first National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. That led to President Obama launching an initiative at the White House called Startup America, which he asked me to chair. I also worked on the Jobs Council, worked on the legislation called the Jobs Act 10, 11 years ago. And that got me more focused on sort of the importance of entrepreneurs, startups in driving job creation, economic development in the country, and also opened my eyes to the fact that there's such a disparity in terms of access to capital depending on where you live. And so that kind of drove some of our efforts around kind of Rise of the Rest. So it started with, more just being an entrepreneur and then trying to figure out how to support other entrepreneurs, invest in other entrepreneurs, and then figure out ways to try to be a voice around more systemic policy changes that could enable a more entrepreneurial economy and do it in a more inclusive way. So it wasn't just about, San Francisco, New York, Boston. It was about, cities all across the country being friendly to entrepreneurs and helping to incubate and scale companies and create jobs in those regions.
So I have to ask, how do you think it's going? I mean, I have my own opinions, but we're here to interview you, and I'm going, it's like, doesn't seem like it's getting easier to start companies, except during that period of time between sort of 2012 and 2022, when, interest rate went to zero, money was free, and it just flowed into all kinds of startups. But, that's sort of come to an end.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, over the last decade, as you know, 75% of venture capital has gone to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So it's overwhelmingly kind of favoring, and really in those states, certain regions, whether it be, San Francisco Bay Area or New York City or Boston, there are different parts of California, New York, and Massachusetts that also kind of feel, kind of left out. So it is fair to say that capital has agglomerated. That leads to talent agglomerating, leading to some tech hubs really doing well, and a lot of other parts of the country kind of feeling kind of left out and left behind. But we have started seeing it shift. In the last decade, 1,400 new venture firms have started in what we call Rise of the Rest cities outside of those major tech hubs. And most of them, as start as small kind of seed funds or venture funds, but I think that's encouraging. And you are starting to see more companies birthed in different parts of the country, and that I think is opening the eyes to investors on the coast that there are opportunities in other places in the middle of the country. And so I think we've made some progress, but there's still clearly a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
In terms of the regulation, so my dad gave me a brilliant insight the other day, which is that VC isn't really regulated in the same way that other forms of investment are regulated. So do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? And also, given your policy expertise, what have you learned about kind of working with governments in order to benefit entrepreneurship?
Well, I think venture capital is regulated. There are certain rules you have to register, with the SEC. If you're, raising, funds, for example, there are rules around who can invest in funds. You have to be an accredited investor to invest in funds, and which is why part of the Jobs Act was trying to kind of level the playing field, allow things like crowdfunding to start getting traction. So it's regulated, but certainly doesn't have kind of a particularly heavy hand of regulation. It's more, kind of basic rules in terms of where you get the capital from and how you invest and report on capital in ways there's transparency and so forth. I think the more important question is, are the companies that are going to be the dominant companies in the next 10, 20 years going to continue to be largely unregulated, which has been the story of much of the last several decades, or are they going to be increasingly regulated? I think there's growing evidence that they'll be increasingly regulated because we've shifted from basically software companies riding on top of the internet to integrating the internet into kind of the real world and really disrupting big industries, big sectors, healthcare, food and agriculture, things like that, which are regulated. And so, understanding that, I think, is becoming more important. I think as Stuart, from your work in venture capital, in the early days of venture capital, when we were getting started, sort of the 70s, 80s, even some of the 90s, venture capitalists were really trying to kind of underwrite technology risk. Can you build it?
Yeah.
Can you build whatever you're talking about, building? Is it possible? Are you going to be able to do it before somebody else does it? And then it sort of shifted 20-ish years ago, maybe 30 years ago, to market risk. Okay, we understand you can build it, but can you market it? Can you commercialize it? Can you sell it? Can you do that better than other people? Because the barriers to entry to building have gone down. So suddenly it's more of a barriers to entry to scale and create significant success. That's driven a lot of the companies. Facebook, for example, was one of dozens of social media platforms. It was the one that was able to break through and get significant traction. Now, increasingly, I think the puck is moving towards policy risk and partner risk. It's we know you can build it. We know you can sell it, but can you navigate the policy, regulatory, kind of world and in different sectors, and can you establish partnerships? Because to really have systems level change, you've got to partner with some of the incumbents in some of those sectors. Healthcare, for example, it's not just about writing the software. That's kind of the table stakes to get in the game. You got to get the doctors and nurses to use it, and the hospitals integrate it, and the health plans to pay for it, and the regulators allow it. Otherwise, you don't really have a shot at building a significant, durable, valuable company. And so I think that's increasingly where things are moving. And it's sometimes frustrating to investors, sometimes frustrating to entrepreneurs to think about government and policy and regulations. But the reality is, when you're dealing with some of the biggest industries in the world and some of the most important aspects of our lives, how we stay healthy, how we learn, what we eat, how we move around, how we invest, pretty basic things, it's not surprising that those are going to have more of a regulatory kind of orientation to them, and that therefore requires the entrepreneurs and the investors who want to participate in this next wave to understand that and embrace that.
So, Steve, I think I'm in way too much danger of getting into politics, but to some degree, what you're talking about is entrepreneurs understanding policy and what the government is trying to accomplish, if it actually is trying to accomplish something. But I'm really stunned that the Department of Justice sued Apple, and I kind of get Amazon because it's got this market power. I can understand Microsoft or IBM going all the way back, but the idea that the Department of Justice can review acquisitions like 10 years after they happen and make a judgment that they shouldn't have happened. The idea that the government sort of in charge of the whole process as opposed to a player is disturbing me, at least. I don't know to what degree you view that.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not surprised that governments, by the way, not just our government, there's a lot of things happening in Europe, in Brussels, are now scrutinizing big tech, because big tech has gotten so big and so powerful, and even in the world of AI, as you all know, right now
that's where I'm headed. That was the next question.
Big tech is getting bigger, and suddenly a company like Microsoft can add $1 trillion of market cap in a couple of years because of the moves they make in AI, and that then makes policymakers a little nervous in terms of how do you make sure that the next generation of entrepreneurs have a shot and can really compete. And in some sectors like search, it's really hard to compete with Google. They really do have a kind of 95% kind of market share. So in a world where big tech gets bigger, in a world where technology is playing a more pervasive kind of role in our lives. It's not surprising to me that governments are paying more attention. It's not surprising to me there's more kind of antitrust review. It's not surprising to me that there's more of a congressional desire to put some guardrails in place with AI, things like that. It's fair to say on certain cases, maybe there's an overreach and maybe some things shouldn't get filed. But that's going to play out over the next few years. And my guess is not just the Justice Department, but the FTC will win some and lose some. I think they're trying to signal to these big companies, not just big tech, but big companies generally, that it's going to not be an easy green light to do a big acquisition. It's going to at least be a flickering yellow, if not sometimes red, and with the idea that might kind of lead some companies to not try to do certain things. Clearly, that's part of the motivation here. But we need to make sure policy strikes the right balance between keeping bad things from happening while also enabling good things to happen. And that's particularly true around innovation, entrepreneurship. How do you kind of lean into the future? How do you kind of maximize the likelihood of new things happening, new technologies being invented, and new companies being able to do it, so that there aren't there aren't barriers to entry that make it difficult for the disruptors to challenge the incumbents. I think that's a healthy process, but taken to an extreme, it can end up being unhealthy.
Yeah. So I do wonder if how you feel about Apple in particular. Google, I get. Amazon, I get. I'm not totally sure about going to Meta and say they shouldn't have acquired Instagram, umpteen years ago when it had no revenue and nobody knew what it was. But in Apple in particular, it's like the thing that they've done it has to create 100% monopoly on the iPhone. And, they're the only one that makes the iPhone, and they make the platform and all of the APIs and control that ecosystem. And it feels like, and I know there's a lot of details there, but it feels like the government's basically challenging the idea that one company can create its own ecosystem and then control it.
Well, I'm not sure they're challenging that. They're challenging if it gets to a position of dominance, then maybe certain aspects of it should be more open. And obviously that's the same issue that was kind of been pushed 25 years ago when there was a Microsoft antitrust issue. Microsoft's argument was exactly your argument for Apple. The Bill Gates argument was, we're trying to improve Windows, we're trying to add new features and functionality into Windows, including internet browsers and other things, just to make it a more compelling software platform, more compelling and integrated and flexible operating system. And he was right, but also it was fair to say that when they had at the time 90% plus market share, that they would add things into their operating system that would basically reduce competition in different sectors of software, and that that some middle ground, some openness is going to be important. And that even the internet, I think we sometimes forget this, but the internet, the fact that it was open and commercialized was not obvious in the early days.
Well, it was an issue, actually, because the original internet we weren't allowed to be commercial. There was no .com.
Exactly. Even when we got started in 1985, it was still illegal for consumers or businesses to be on the internet. It was still restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. So if you're on the Stanford campus or work for the CIA, you could be on the internet. But if you're an average consumer or average business, you couldn't. And that had to change with Congress kind of passing the Telecom Act that basically commercialized access to the internet. But the other thing that drove that success was a government decision. In this case, it was a judicial decision by Judge Green to break up Ma Bell. The sense was AT&T was too powerful. It was stifling innovation. They were arguing that by having an integrated, system, they could, with all the phones they controlled and all the network, connectivity they controlled, they could provide a safer, more secure telecommunications system. But the decision was, that might have some benefits, there are more benefits to have competition. And it was one big telephone company were breaking into 7 regional telephone companies.
We were around for that. Innovation. Saw that happen.
And at the same time, it required those phone companies to open up their networks so companies like AOL could plug into those networks. That was, that open access is what drove the success of the internet. We need similar open access with AI.
So we have been through this going, all the way back to when you're younger than I am, but even when I was a kid. But we've watched the government do things that have promoted competition, and the government do things that have gotten in the way of it. And I wonder, we're in the current environment where it's like 15 months after Sam Altman and OpenAI like redefine everybody's view of artificial intelligence. We've also been through all of the waves of artificial intelligence since the 80s. So the government's really trying to figure out how to have a role to play, just put it that way. And it is different in Europe. And you could say maybe Europe's smarter, maybe America is smarter, but how do you feel about the government trying to figure out how to put a fence around this thing?
Well, I think the Europe initial, at least what's been proposed with their AI legislation, is an overreach and likely will stifle innovation. So that's too much of a heavy hand, too much of a, as I said before, worrying about what might go wrong and not focusing enough on unleashing what might go right. It will be interesting to see what we do in the United States. I think there is a recognition that is an overreach. At the same time, I think there is a broad sense, and it's not a partisan thing. It's a fairly broad Republican and Democratic support for something, around AI that provides some guardrails. And oh, by the way, some of the big tech companies are lobbying aggressively in AI to try to have rules set that strengthen their hand and weaken the hand of disruptors. And some of that debate is around open source, which some of the arguments have been it's too risky, that could unleash some bad things that could happen in terms of how the AI is developed. And there are some risks that if it's more broad-based, dissemination of these tools and more broad-based dispersed innovation, it's harder to limit, it's harder to regulate, it's harder to control it. But I believe it is critically important that open source be part of the path forward in AI, and we don't just rely on a few big tech companies to provide those platforms. We make sure we maximize the likelihood that it's open to everybody. And I even testified at the second Senate AI summit on that point, that making sure as we think about this, it's not just about codifying rules that essentially strengthen the hand of the incumbents. It's creating a policy framework that does things in a smart, balanced way, but errs on the side of unleashing the next generation of disruptors.
What are the things that the government generally does in order to stifle that normally? What is a well-balanced policy regulation that improves the good and limits the bad? I know that's a very broad question, but any good examples you have of policies that really hit the nail on the head in terms of that?
Well, again, I go back to some of the early experiences I had in the early days of the internet. I thought the government actually got that pretty right. They basically said, Ma Bell is too powerful, let's break it up. Let's force all the phone companies to open up their networks to create a very aggressive competition in the telecommunications space. Tons of companies were created that basically would not have been created otherwise. And also in those early days, because the internet was so kind of in its infancy, when we started AOL, only 3% of people were online. Those 3% were online like an hour a week. So it was super, super early. They said, we're not quite sure how this is going to play out. We're going to let it run. So we're going to have a relatively light touch on regulation. Initially, we're not going to tax e-commerce, for example. We're going to see how this runs. And then once it started, getting traction, people said, okay, well, now e-commerce is a more significant part of the economy. It does make sense to have, sales tax that applies on the internet, things like that. So I think that was a good example. What's different with AI, which creates a challenge, I think, for the policymakers, is the internet really took a couple of decades before it got traction. It seems to a lot of people as sort of overnight success, but the 80s and even a good part of the 90s, it was still a struggle. It was really the kind of 95 when things kind of really started accelerating. By 2000, we kind of hit kind of went from, not too many years before, nobody knew or cared about the internet to suddenly everybody had to be part of the internet and couldn't live without it. And that happened. It was slow building and then suddenly happened quickly. With AI, it's sort of the core technologies have been developing slowly, really over several decades. But what's happened in the last 2 years and the acceleration of investment in the space and the pace of investment is really dramatically different. Instead of $1 million backing a company, suddenly billions of dollars are backing these companies.
Yeah.
And even ChatGPT, I think the number was they went from 0 to 100 million users in like 3 months. That took 30 years for the internet. And so that, as a result, that is forcing kind of the policymakers to the table a little sooner than maybe they would have expected, or maybe even would have wanted.
So let me ask this question, Steve, because you just said it. It took 30 years for the internet to get to the same place that OpenAI did in 3 months. But the pace of change, it keeps accelerating. This is clear for anybody that's had the kind of lifespan that we've had so far. And it feels like it can't possibly continue to accelerate. Right. Maybe that's just I'm an old fart and grumpy, about things. But I wonder how you feel about that. You're 6 years younger than I am. I did look it up. So, as you look forward, can we continue to, and AI will contribute to this? I guess that's part of the concern, is that AI at some point will be, will pass the Turing test, become smarter than us, and take over.
Well, I would separate in two things. I think some of these core enabling technologies like AI are accelerating, and I'm not sure what would slow that down, other than potentially some policy kind of thing that we talked about. At the same time, I think the most profound uses of AI, and more broadly, the most profound uses of many technologies that are getting to scale, are when the technologies converge with industries. And when that happens, I think things actually slow down. And healthcare is a perfect example of that. We talked about some of those dynamics earlier, but the core enabling technologies that can result in more precision medicine, for example, are been developing rapidly. But what makes those technologies useful is getting data from multiple sources, hospitals, for example, in areas like oncology. That takes time, that takes partnerships. And so I think you'll see dynamics in some of these sectors where it takes, maybe a decade to have an overnight success. And you're building, slowly and steadily, and then finally you hit sort of an acceleration, point. You're seeing that with autonomous vehicles. A lot of people 10 years ago said they're going to happen overnight. Suddenly all our streets and all our cities are going to have, kind of robo taxis. That hasn't happened. It's actually happened relatively slowly. It wasn't the technology, wasn't there. There was still some refinements, certainly the technology needed, but it really was more getting the data, getting the policy support at a city level, getting people, consumers, to be comfortable, that it was safe. That's taken a decade, and now we're at an inflection point. I think things are likely to accelerate, but that is an example of something where the technology looked like it was, going to be ubiquitous overnight, and in fact has been very slow for the past decade.
So
only a few cities.
Have you taken a ride in a Waymo or a cruise?
I have. I think it's a great experience. The first time I got into it, I was like, whoa, it's still a little freaky deaky, but it really works well. I think it does feel safe, and I think more and more people will, get comfortable with that. But that takes time, and so most of the big disruptions I think are going to happen in society are going to be more like that, where yes, the technology can enable something to happen quickly. But it's going to take longer for people to get comfortable, take longer for regulators to allow certain things, take longer for some of the incumbent companies that have to be at the table and participate. There'll certainly be some full stack, kind of companies that really do everything, but more and more it's going to be kind of people doing some part of the value chain well and partnering with other people. Those partnerships take time, policy takes time. So technology may accelerate, but the innovation may decelerate.
I'm getting the idea that you're a techno optimist, as opposed to
I'm a techno optimist, but not in a kind of with a caveat, which is I recognize that every technology starts with the dreams of what's possible, and those dreams usually happen. But with it comes some unintended consequences that are negative. And I saw this certainly with the internet. What's happened with the internet has been fabulous. I'm super proud of the role we played in getting it going. but have there been some downsides to the internet? Absolutely. And so how do you maximize the upsides and minimize some of the downsides and be optimistic about the future, lean into the future, but at the same time, don't have your head in the sand. Recognize that there are some challenges, and that then leads you to say, well, maybe it does make sense for governments to be at the table, even if it's frustrating, even if it slows things down. They're chartered by us, our society, to figure out how to strike the right balance, and they need to be part of the discussion.
Steve,
so Stuart is a AI whisperer. That's his job now. Self-defined, but that's how it works.
Yeah, and it's wild to consider. And I'm actually down here in Argentina as well, and my whole thought has been going towards like there is some regulation that is going to happen in Argentina. I don't think the new president is planning on doing absolutely no regulation, although that is his message. Right. And there is going to be some smart regulation down here, and it's like, this is an interesting conversation. I think that the people in that administration might want to hear. So I would love to talk about like how that internet, because this series is the internet, how the personal computer led to the internet, and the internet led to the phones, and then the phones kind of led to the social media. And this idea that only 3% of people were online for an hour a week. I imagine that was probably in 1985, 1990.
1985.
1985. Okay. And how did the internet get started? There's this idea that Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of linear. Al Gore also, I think, claimed it. Yeah. So how did the internet, who are the key people that maybe not many people have heard of, who were responsible for making sure that regulation was good, but also the technology and the business also were all combined there?
A series of things. First of all, the internet itself was a government project. The defense agency, DARPA, really was what drove it. And the original desire was to build a network that could withstand the nuclear attack. So a highly distributed, redundant network was what was called for. And that essentially what was built. And, as we discussed before, initially it was used for that purpose, and then was expanded to allow, college campuses, others to be connected to it. But it was, a couple decades into its evolution when it really became commercialized and was available to everybody. So, you got to give credit to sort of the core, inventors that built the technologies, of which there are many, partnering with many companies. You got to give credit to the people that were funding it, throughout a government agency. You got to give credit to, as we discussed before, the people that then made the decision, including Al Gore, by the way, even though he got criticized for suggesting he invented the internet, he was pretty pivotal in commercializing the internet and passing that Telecom Act. And then the ball kind of was handed to the entrepreneurs, and there were hundreds of companies that played a role in really then taking it and running with it. Initially, there were a lot of big companies that were participating. I mentioned the Prodigy joint venture with IBM and Sears. Time Inc. was doing some something in space. AT&T themselves were doing some things in the space. Knight Ridder, newspaper company, was doing some things in the space. Citibank. There were a bunch of people that were doing things that were big companies trying to innovate, and there was a smaller number of younger companies like AOL that was trying to do it from scratch. And it took a decade, and some of those ventures succeeded. Most of them failed, and eventually things started coalescing, and you saw an acceleration. And then Tim Berners-Lee came later with the creation of the World Wide Web, which really helped popularize the internet. And then, of course, Netscape, and the IPO of Netscape was sort of the moment where the internet arrived in terms of being more of a mainstream phenomenon. But there have been a couple of decades of effort before that happened. And even AOL, we'd started in 85, Netscape IPO, I believe, was 95. So that was 10 years into it that things started really kind of accelerating.
Yeah, so Steve, I just have to correct one thing, because Stuart said 3% in an hour a day. That was actually, I think, after 95, because I remember, I was at Infowald, and in order to get on the internet, I had to go to the IT department and get a floppy disk with Mosaic on it and install it on my computer, because if you weren't on the internet, you didn't know how to get to the internet unless you knew the command line and understood how to create it. So it was like right there in 95 was the transition from, all the things you talked about to people started, if you had an IT department or knew what you were doing, started actually getting on the internet from their personal computers. So
Well, even
I
the
remember
debate with
that
personal
experience.
computers, we spent 5 years. I personally was spent all this time evangelizing the personal computer manufacturers. I mentioned some of the partnerships we formed.
Yeah.
It took years to convince them to build a communications modem into the PCs. Their argument was it's a peripheral device. Only about 30% of people bought computers bought a modem. Most people were using a computer for spreadsheets or word processor or something. The view was, why would people want to connect to other computers or connect to other people? Well, what's the point of that? And we said, well, we actually think that might be the killer app of the PC, is actually people connecting to each other and connecting to information. But what seems obvious now was not obvious at all then.
Yeah.
And it took several years. And it was only when IBM re-entered the PC market for consumers with their, I think it was 1989, and they decided to build a modem in. That then suddenly some of the other people said, well, if IBM's doing it, maybe we should do it. And 5 years later, everybody had built a modem. And that's when our AOL software was installed on pretty much every PC. And that's when our growth really accelerated. But it took years before you got to the point where even the idea of the internet shifted from being peripheral to being essential.
Yeah, you just said something which I feel like is my life job, which is trying to put yourself out in the future and see what will be obvious then, rather than right now, because we're all struggling with generative AI, and some of us know that AGI is actually something different further in and you try to put yourself out there and say, if you look back, what will be obvious at that time that wasn't now? And so it's like trying to determine the unobvious is really the trick to figuring this out in advance. And so Stuart and I have actually say this, we ended up doing this because we started talking to each other. He is in Buenos Aires and I'm up here actually in Santa Fe now. And so we started having these weekly calls. And one of the values to me is I get to see what it looks like from a person who is 32 years younger than I am, which is a really interesting thing. So the idea that he can be a prompt engineer and build a business out of being an AI whisperer is not something I would have ever thought you could do probably a year ago.
Yep. It was.
I'm handing it to you, Stuart. Go for
it was pretty wild in March 2023 to finally get access to GPT-4. I had gotten access to GPT 3.5 in 2020. I believe it was like in September, October. I was like, okay, this is cool. I finally get it. I finally understand the AI, like, because I know both of you know this, but maybe some of my listeners don't know. But AI is like, it's not something that was meant to have consumer interactions. It's something that goes on in the background. It's very meta. And then ChatGPT was this first implementation. So very wild to think about. And for me personally, I believe it's bringing us back to that early 1980s personal computing zeitgeist, which was like, you're an individual, I'm an individual. Let's like work together to create this new world. And then, as you were mentioning, Steve, it's sort of like that dream kind of got shattered in the late 2000s and 2010s. I personally believe with social media. I know my dad also sees that part of that as well. And so yeah, it's just we're entering a new world that I think is going to be much more about human augmentation. I think a lot of people are going in terms of AI to sort of like create a super intelligence outside of human intelligence. But I think it's going to be more of a augmentation of our own intelligence through this very, very useful tool. I would love to kind of, and this is part of our show, is to like go back to history to understand the lessons. But in terms of AI, what is your thought, Steve, in terms of human augmentation versus super intelligence that is not human?
Well, we've done a number of investments really over the last decade through our various funds. And that's our view, which is that we're not so much focused on investing in the kind of horizontal platforms, LLMs, things like that. We're more focused on how AI can change big industries and improve the way people do their jobs. And a great example is we backed a company in Chicago called Tempus that is focused on using AI to more precisely diagnose disease, so you can have a more precise intervention and save lives. Initially focused on cancer, now it's expanded to other things. They now have 2,000 employees and are working with most of the majority of hospitals in the country, and starting to work with pharma as well. And that is using AI and other technologies as well to basically diagnose disease and be able to be much more precise in deciding what to do for a specific patient. Those are the kind of things that are really hard to imagine you have the same impact without leveraging those technology. And it makes in this case the oncologist much more effective, as well as being much more productive. And so looking for ways to do that, AI and other technology, robotics, other things, will it displace some jobs? For sure it will displace some jobs. Every technology has that. The question is what new jobs are created by it, and what existing jobs are improved and augmented by it. And that's where a lot of our investment focus has been.
So I have to ask you, this is a VC to a VC question. We've not invested in any AI companies. We've invested in a bunch of companies that are using AI to become competitive and build their moat around them. And boy, this area of healthcare, there's a lot of people think that they've got the secret. And I wonder how you kind of distinguish between the one you invested in and everybody else who thinks they're doing something similar, maybe in healthcare in general, or maybe in a focused area. But I wonder how you think about that as AI as an enabler versus AI as a company.
I think, what we learned is any big idea, that has potential to be a big company is not going to be a unique idea. There'll be other people doing it. So you just have to recognize that it's sort of and even when you hear entrepreneurs pitching and they tell you they have no competition, that's a problem, because normally it means they're lying. They do have competition. They're not acknowledging the competition, or they're ignorant. They have competition and they don't know about it, or it's a small market and there's no competition because it's not interesting enough for others to be pursuing it. And so we acknowledge that these areas are going to be hyper competitive. Then the question is, what are you underwriting to? And for us, obviously, the team is critically important, and the track record they have and the credibility they have, particularly in a world where partnerships are going to become more important. Do they have the ability to build trust and forge those partnerships? And also, do they understand, because of these, as we've discussed before, often have a regulatory overlay? Do they have a theory of the case there? So can they build off the technology, viewing the technology as sort of the table stakes, and build a broader ecosystem around what they're doing? And so that's really what we're looking for: people that have the theory of the case, that they're going to have a significant impact, but they recognize they're going to likely need to do that with partnerships, and have some theory of how those partnerships will be formed. Ideally, some evidence of some initial partnerships already being formed, as well as the theory of the case of how policy will shift and unlock opportunity. And because when people think about policy and governments and regulations, usually it's around stifling things, slowing things down. But policy changes also can unlock opportunities, whether it be the commercialization of the internet, which we talked about, or even one of the companies we backed, DraftKings, when the Supreme Court ruled and states could decide what they want to do in terms of gaming, that suddenly created opportunities for a company like DraftKings that previously hadn't existed. So those are some of the things we look for.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. It's sometimes a little hard to sort it out and kind of find the right team, and eventually you end up having to decide you're going to back that particular team. So I've never heard of Tempus. I don't do healthcare. I just
wait, why not
understand?
Okay.
I don't understand the regulatory framework, first of all, and I don't understand the process, particularly if you're doing what they call bugs and drugs, but the process of actually developing a particular technology, like mRNA is actually now the stock symbol for
Moderna.
Thank you, Moderna. And they invented mRNA. Now they have the stock symbol for it. boy, I wish I'd known about that company when it got started. But when it got started, nobody knew about it because the pandemic hadn't happened yet, but they just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And boy, did it take off, of course. And it's still worth like 40 or $50 billion, even though the pandemic is over. So anyway, this process is this is why I love being a venture capitalist. You get to talk to all the smart people and try to figure out who's the smartest one, and that's going to make it happen.
But also,
Is-
I think the interesting about being venture capitalist is you kind of have the opportunity to live in the future. Yeah, everybody's pitching ideas about what's going to happen 10 or 20 years from now, which is just interesting, intellectually interesting. If you're curious, it's sort of, and then if you talk to enough people, you start seeing some patterns emerge that, you start in your own head having some theory of the case of maybe how this will develop, and that can kind of help inform decisions. But ultimately, obviously, the entrepreneurs who take the ball and run with it, and kind of often they do have to pivot, and what they thought initially they were going to do ends up shifting, and they're doing something else, and so you kind of have to go with the flow. But ultimately, it's about kind of investing in the future by backing people that are reimagining the future and going to do what they can to help usher in that future.
So I loved your point about partnerships, and I want to go back to that. What is the essence of great partnerships? And if there are founders listening to this, like, how can they understand like how to not only find the best potential partners, but then once they're in that relationship, grow that relationship so that it's a win-win situation?
It's really tricky. It starts with understanding where you think the things are going to develop over the next, call it 10 years, understanding who some of the key players are going to be, and then trying to figure out, is there a way to kind of co-opt them, and instead of having them emerge as competitors, they can be the allies. I talked about what we did in the early days of AOL. We partnered with a PC manufacturer. We thought they were natural, players in this market. They didn't necessarily have the core skill sets. Our pitch was, you have the PCs. We have this expertise with the service. Why don't we do a joint venture around your computer, create a customized service for your computer, and share revenues, and we'll take the risk of building it, and you take essentially the lead in marketing it, and be a win-win kind of thing. That partnership mentality was attractive to them. They said, well, if something's happening in this sector, we don't quite understand this internet thing, we're not quite sure how it's going to develop, but we kind of know we should do something, and doing something with somebody who's focused on this in a way that we have preserved some flexibility, optionality to change over time, but we get some experience in the short run, kind of made sense. And so that got us going. Without those partners, we never would have survived. And for those companies, got them into the market faster with less risk than they would have been on their own. So figuring out what is, the logical kind of mix of partners you want, and look at things through their side of the table, not focus on what you want, but focus on what you think they should want, and then figure out is there a middle ground there where you can align your interests and their interests, or your perception of their interests, because sometimes they're not quite sure, in ways that create an ability to do something. And then once you start doing something, obviously you have to execute well, and continue to prove to them that it makes sense to continue to work together, as opposed to go off and do something else. And sometimes people will split up, and the partnerships will not be sustained, but they will be helpful for some phase of a company's development. But if there are partnerships that are more sustainable, those clearly have some benefits. A good example of the technology that turned into a company that was super reliant on partnerships and on policy is a company we backed with our growth fund 8 or 10 years ago called Clear. The biometric technology, they decided to apply it to airports so you could get through security faster, kind of a fast pass. But that was sort of the beginning of the journey. The real journey was getting the Transportation Authority, TSA, to allow it, and getting airports to basically do deals with them, where they essentially rented space and were allowed to create essentially their own line. So the biometric technology was interesting, but that was like the table stakes. The real value is created by the partnerships they formed and the policy they navigated to take that technology and turn it into a real network. Now I think they have 50 airports and working with sports venues and others as well. So it's becoming a broader, kind of application of that technology. I think you're going to see more and more companies like that, where it's the partnerships and policy is where the real value is created.
So I have to ask. I went through, trying to remember which airport I went through, but at some level, when you have TSA pre and you have clear right side by side, it makes sense actually for them to merge. But TSA pre is like the U.S. government. It's kind of hard to merge with the U.S. government. And clear is a commercial operation. And airlines have started, and I think I saw this in Atlanta with Delta, have started to do their own face and eyeball recognition, so you don't have to do either one. So I wonder if it's a very specific question, but I wonder if there's a competitive challenge for Clear about how the ecosystem is evolving in a way that won't be helpful to them.
Sure. I should say we invested a long time ago. They went public 4 or 5 years ago. We're no longer involved in terms of, so I don't know exactly what their plans are, but I actually believe some of those
I know the VC thing is like, oh, well,
some of those airlines you mentioned are partnering with Clear to provide kind of end-to-end solutions. Everybody's trying to reduce friction for travel. And so, and they are talking to different airports about, kind of ways to leverage their technology and platform in other ways. So yeah, I think it goes back to what we talked about before. When things get clear and the market opportunity is there, competition emerge. The question then is, are the existing kind of leaders able to be nimble and agile and continue to figure out where things are going and what new partnerships need to be formed so they stay in the lead? If not, they'll be left behind.
So the best partnership, I think, historically, the most interesting is IBM and Microsoft, because fundamentally, Microsoft did a deal with IBM that constrained IBM's opportunity because the real point was in the operating system, not in the hardware. And anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there because that was one of the reasons that Microsoft got challenged as a monopoly, is that they were able to disadvantage the previous monopolist. And anyway, so.
No, I think it's a good example. Microsoft was basically built on partnerships. Initially, seeing the opportunity for an operating system because IBM wanted one. They actually didn't have one, so they bought one. And then they, started leveraging that into what became, Windows, and were able to do a deal with IBM because IBM wanted to enter the market and wasn't focused specifically on the operating system. And so that created momentum for Microsoft. And then Microsoft did partnerships with all the other PC manufacturers and suddenly was loaded on virtually every PC and suddenly was a really valuable company. So that's a great example of the value of partnerships. And what Microsoft has been doing in the last few years is quite crafty in the AI space in terms of the investments they're making, the way they're structuring those investments to expand their footprint in AI through partnerships. And so I think they've learned the value of partnerships, and I think more and more entrepreneurs will learn that lesson as well as we think about this next phase of innovation.
So just a couple more minutes, we'll end on time and such. I have this dying question in the back of my head because it's so interesting, and we might not be able to answer it in the last few minutes. But academia, big science. 1945, we built a nuclear bomb using science. And then the internet, as you mentioned, was a direct consequence of that. What about academia? Where does academia play a role? Where does the university system, or where does science play a role in this?
Well, I think it's a critical role, and universities in particular have, for decades, particularly in this country, been the incubators of ideas and the trainers of talent and the aggregators of talent. People come there to learn and work together and collaborate on different projects. What most universities have not done that effectively, with some exceptions, is figure out ways to continue to be at the epicenter of innovation. How do you take some of those ideas out of the university labs and put them in the marketplace, get them in the hands of entrepreneurs? How do you create a more entrepreneurial kind of ecosystem around your university? And as we've done work on Rise the Rest, we've worked with a number of different universities in different parts of the country, and they recognize this as both has been a challenge, but also as an opportunity. And so I think they will be able to play a more central role, not just in a few coastal places like Silicon Valley, with what Stanford's doing, or Cal, or other places, but much more broadly, because some of the best universities we have in the country, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, or Michigan in Ann Arbor, or Ohio in Columbus, or Georgia Tech in Atlanta, are great. Some of the most important national labs are spread around the country, and they can help unleash the next wave of innovation for the country, but also do it in communities all across the country, which ties in with Rise of Rest. So universities play a central role, and I recognize that they are more important in terms of the innovation economy than they perhaps have given themselves credit for.
So StartX didn't take stock, I believe, inside of startups. Is there any sort of model that you've seen, or that universities do accept it, or like what is that partnership between universities and businesses?
It's different universities trying different things. I think I favor a lighter touch approach, where you spend less time on a tech transfer office trying to get a smallish royalty stream, and more, how do you unleash more of these ideas, get them in the hands of more entrepreneurs, have more of those companies succeed, and then in the long run get that back through big donations, which is what's happened with Stanford, for example, where Google essentially was created on the Stanford campus, but the big money came from the success of Google and long-term donations to support the Stanford endowment. So there have definitely been examples of tech transfer that have worked for different universities and different core technologies, but sometimes the tech transfer offices slow things down and don't even pay for themselves. And it's a more entrepreneurial approach is something more and more universities are now looking at.
Thank you so much, Steve, and it was a great pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Steve. Great to catch up.
See you both. See you later.
I'll play.